So before I get started, just a little bit of quick housekeeping for those that are new to a GPSA webinar. Everybody's microphones are currently muted, so we won't have any background noise throughout the webinar. You can still ask questions, and you do that down on the bottom left through the chat box, so you can make a comment or ask a question of Peter. I'll try to highlight those, and hopefully Peter will see them, or I'll take a note of them and we can come back to them. We're also recording this webinar for those who aren't able to participate tonight, who would like to have a view later. This recording will be available in a couple of weeks' time on our YouTube channel. In fact, all our webinars are recorded and available on the GPSA YouTube channel so that you can watch at any time. So I'd like to hand over now to Peter, and I was just going to mention that Peter's recently returned from a visit to Canada, and he might tell us a little bit about that trip when he introduces himself. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Good evening all. Yes, I've recently come back from nearly 6 weeks in Canada where we explored the eastern side, the maritime states, and it was part of our mission to consume our body weight in seafood, which I think we achieved. So the visit finished up with a conference, the Residency Education Conference that was held in Quebec City, which was great fun, where I prepared and delivered a couple of workshops. And in fact, one of the workshops that I delivered was actually on this topic. So I've had an opportunity to run through this a little bit. Just to let you know a little bit about myself, I went from rural general practice into GP training way back when the college ran the training program last time, which just proves that if you sit around long enough, things come around again. I moved from GP training into undergraduate education, and over the last, so I currently practice clinically only 1 day a week. I'm a full-time academic now at the University of New South Wales, where the main things I deal with obviously are teaching, but are assessment, and particularly look after our portfolio assessment. Thanks for the comments and hellos down the side. I can't promise that it's going to be tougher than hard quiz, but you should all be the content experts because we're going to be talking a lot about clinical practice and what we're doing. But I am a bit intimidated by being up against Will Anderson, so we'll see how we go and hope we have fun. So welcome all. I thought I'd start off with quickly a question to get you into the mood and find out how many of you currently have a GP registrar in your practice. I'll give you a minute to ponder that and hit the button. If I'm lucky, I'll see the answers. Lots and lot of you. Okay, lots and lots of you are saying yes. Some people too. Wow. So almost all of you currently have a practice, have a registrar in your practice. That's great. So so this will be alive for all of you. So I might move on then quickly to the next question, which is the topic of tonight. Do you discuss reflective practice with your GP registrar? While you're considering that, I'll give you some people's versions. Oh, where'd it go? So we'll see how they pop up. And here we go. The results are coming in. But most of you are already, well, the more the results come in, the more they even up. So about 2/3 of you actually discuss reflective practice with your registrar. Fine. And a lot of you are sitting on the fence. Great. I'll move on from that one because what I really want to ask you is how do you recognize reflective practice in your registrar? What are the sorts of things that you look for to see if your registrar is actually practicing reflectively? And what are the things that you would discuss with your registrar, or if somebody had to ask you, how do you know, then how would you recognise it? Now, a lot of people see reflection simply as that process of looking backwards or having a look at yourself, and we'll talk. Yes. Marissa sent out a message. Please respond in the chat box when you ask some questions. So as these come in, excellent. Lots of people saying that they ask questions of themselves, they engage and ask questions, and a couple have highlighted behaviour change. Types of questions. Okay, so one of the difficulties here, of course, is that the area is bedeviled by confusion. And one of the confusions and contentions is because we don't have a really good definition. There are a whole lot of areas, a whole lot of people talking about it, and a lot of people saying, why? What would you do that for if it's only about learning what you did in the past? And there's a great one. They get their aha moment when they look on their face when they see something. So whether that's reflection or not, the question then is, what do you do with it? So let's move on to some of the definitions. The first of the definitions that I like to use is from John Dewey, who was a pragmatic philosopher. You may have come across Dewey in your readings or if you visited the library. And you can see this was from nearly a century ago. So this is a new and challenging idea that we're still coming to terms with. Using his 1930s language, he talks about persistent and careful consideration of beliefs and forms of knowledge. Importantly, he then goes on to say, in light of the grounds that support it and the conclusions to which it tends. So that's a little bit, that's a very early, but I think encapsulates a lot of what we'll talk about in a few minutes. Those of you who've looked at the literature on reflection will probably have encountered Donald Schoen, who studied professionals, particularly more technically professionals, but he then moved on to encapsulate this in the idea of helping students to become aware of what they currently know and taking more responsibility for their own learning. Moving into a more clinical area, this is from Stephen Brookfield. Those of you that have been reading education literature would have come across Brookfield's Skillful Teacher. Great topic for a book, great title for a book. I wish I'd found that one. And he regards this as the most important feature of reflective practice is actually the focus on hunting assumptions, not just on knowledge, but actually looking at what's behind that knowledge, what do you know about, and what are the things that cause you to reach your conclusions. So what are the frameworks? And if you're not examining those frameworks, then he would suggest that you're not actively reflecting. And the final definition is much more recent from Nguyen and Charlin and the group at Montreal. And they talk about processing thoughts and actions and frameworks with a view to change. And this bit of change is really, I think, at the core of what reflective practice is about. I deliberately used the term practice in the title so that we could have a behaviour to focus on. The idea of just sitting and considering or pondering doesn't necessarily lead to any outcomes. And that's why the question before about what do you observe or what behaviours are there was critical, I think, to getting inside this business of reflective practice. So reflective practice tests knowledge, tests assumptions against the experience of your day-to-day lived practice, and particularly moves towards some sort of action. It really has to lead in some sort of lead to some sort of outcome or change. A number of you talked about changes affecting patients, and we'll come back to the impact on patients later on. But the idea of changing your clinical behaviour or thinking about things in a different way is central to what I see is reflective practice. So reflective practice tests knowledge, assumptions, and leads on to actions. One of the ways that we envisage this is that if you think about the attributes that make up an individual practitioner, the outer ring are those things, the applied knowledge and skills. That's what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and these are things that are most prone to change. Knowledge changes, information changes, we can develop our skills. The next ring, going in the interactional skills, are things that we also can develop, but which are much more personal. So they're things like communication, teamwork, self-directed, and the ability to learn. But at the core of our performance and the core of a lot of our training are issues around this ability to reflect, to turn things into reflective practice, and also those ethical and moral dimensions that we bring along to our decision making. Those of you that have read about curricula and looked, for example, at the Dundee curriculum, where the group in Dundee have a similar diagram, but they've actually got it round the other way. But I think this way, what we're looking at is the core of what somebody does and how we alter the attributes and the behaviours that are at that core. We know we can change knowledge and skills by interventions, but it's a much slower, more laborious, but in the end more rewarding process to address behaviours and attributes. This brings us then to the question of assessment. Why would we bother assessing it? In fact, there's quite a lot of discussion in the literature saying that you can't really assess reflection. Well, one of the reasons for why it's important is, as I'm sure you have been observed in your trainees, the people who most benefit from reflection, or we think would most benefit, are the ones who tend to stay away from doing it unless they're actually taken to it and encouraged, or in some cases forced to do it, but given a technique. We do know that assessment drives behaviour. That's one of the truisms of most of our education. And whilst we're in the luxurious position in clinical practice of our trainees, our registrars wanting to be the best doctor that they can, they're still going to focus on whatever the assessment is. And even if the assessment is your review of that trainee, your interaction with the trainee, and perhaps an end of month or end of term report, that's still important. This is one place where you need to do away with the dichotomy between formative and summative assessment. What we're looking here is at a behaviour over time, and how that develops. So it's important to consider this developmental approach rather than a pass-fail approach, that you think about this, how is this person reflecting, how mature is their reflection, and what can I do to help them build stronger reflective practice skills. But like any behaviour, it's something that you need to practice regularly. The other reasons to assess it, not surprisingly, are that it's part of the outcomes that the college put together. They, in their reflective skills area, talk about a little bit postmodern, they talk about the capacity for reflection as being a reflective skill. So I think we can probably tease that out a little bit more, but certainly the idea of developing skills of learning, developing your own supports, and developing coping skills, they impact on reflection. I think the UK College, in their definition, has actually gone a little bit better into the language of reflection. And it's thinking about your practice systematically, and wherever translating, back to that earlier definition, translating those ideas into action using improvement techniques or audit. They also talk about prioritisation, managing time, and the ability to work autonomously. And finally, the very important element of reflection is recognising your own personal and professional limits. Sometimes those limits are to do with technical things, and that we spend a lot of time with our registrars saying, well, here's a point at which you ought to refer. This is somewhere that's beyond your limits. But it also addresses the personal limits. How far can you go? How do you know when you've had enough? How do you recognise when you're getting tired, when you're not performing at your best? And the appropriate capacity to seek help when it's necessary. I think this definition actually captures much more clearly to me the sorts of things that I would be looking for with a registrar or a trainee. If you're not getting there, then we have a starting point. So if people are unclear about this process, and many people that we see at registrar level already come with a strong reflective capacity, and all we need to do is help that grow. I'll come back to that process of helping it grow later on. But there are people who really struggle with this. And one way to start this is to start very simply with some tasks that most people can accommodate. First of all, and this is what we do with our beginning medical students, is introduce them to this model, which was taken by us from the nursing literature, of thinking about an activity and asking these three questions. What was it? What actually happened? So think about something that happened where you had to use your knowledge and skills, and try and illustrate that with examples. In the situation with your registrars, you've got no shortage of examples. You can use this conversational technique saying, well, what happened in that consultation, or what happened at this point in the consultation? Turning that review into a reflective process begins with the second question. How does this then relate to what you knew before? How does it relate to what you have done before? Does it alter anything that you thought? How does it add value to what you've had before? And then the important action bit is, what are you going to do as a result of identifying this particular, or having had this experience or had this challenge, and how it's going to fit in your progress. We start this right at the very beginning with our students by giving them a very simple task, which is thinking about your communication skills. And as it says, we do this in the very first week of the course. We get them to think about the challenges that they've had with their communication. But you can do this with anything. You can certainly, if you want to introduce this process, use anything that they've learned, any skill, any topic. It might be a sport, it might be a musical instrument, and you can get people talking about how did they learn that, what did they want to learn, how did they know that where they were going, and how did they find it? Was it hard? Was it easy? What sort of emotional responses did you have? And how did you know when you stopped or when you needed assistance? So these are processes that you can use and apply very easily to the reluctant reflector, if you like. And excuse me. So back to then the process of assessment. If you turn this then into an area of working with cases, working with patients, then each case study, each time you talk about a patient, you want your trainee to be able to self-assess the quality of what they've done, either the interaction with the patient or the report. In this case, we use these particular form of words for a written case report. But the student should, or the trainee at the end, should be able to give an assessment of their own performance, their strengths and weaknesses. That they should be familiar with. They should certainly think about the processes that they've gone to understand what happened with the case. That is, how did they learn more about the case, articulate plans to improve that process, and articulate activities that they might incorporate into the future, drawing implications on what the case said to the wider aspects of their learning. So what I'd like you to do now is, using the chat box, is think about some behaviours that you think we heard before in your responses. You gave me a number of responses about behaviour change, questioning and so on. Can you think about specific behaviours that would indicate your registrar displayed reflection in their practice? See what we get up there. Having got those definitions out of the way, hopefully you've started thinking about, how does this apply in the practice? What am I doing with, what does the trainee do? What does the registrar do? That will allow me to create a narrative about that person. think. While you're thinking, this is a model that we've found to be quite useful based on the work that I've shown and then told. Some of you will see the associations between this model and the learning cycle. That, as we mentioned before, there's an event, something happens. It could be an encounter with a patient. It could be an encounter with another staff member. It could be something that the registrar is wrestling with. Then, okay, they've got to use their knowledge and skills. They've got to try and solve a problem and think about that problem. How did this impact on what they thought before, what they knew before? And if you're thinking back to the definitions, did this challenge any assumptions or beliefs that they had about this particular circumstance? Then, of course, we get to the action part. So, and as a number of you have mentioned, it's changing the management at the next visit with the patient. So you're already 5 slides ahead of me, which is great. So setting out why they do things, being able to explain why they do things, and being able to explain the circumstances in which they would change. So it's that, as Alfonso has said, ability to critique their own assumptions. That's a nice way of putting it. So they need to go on, learn something from this, do some more activity, and then back into the cycle again. Think about, does this challenge any underlying beliefs? Does it alter my understanding of a particular process, whether it's a physiological process or whether it's an interaction process? Now, we're at the point where, as you've identified, looking at this is an interactive process, it builds on feedback, and it's a practice. So therefore, it requires practice to improve it. Reflection is not something which we effectively do by ourselves. One of the issues that we know, if you've read the literature on self-assessment by people like Kevin Eva and Jeff Norman, is that we're not particularly good at self-assessment. Unless we've got some external points of reference, we often see what we want to see when we look at things, or just as frequently, perhaps more frequently, we miss things. We have black holes. We have black spots that we don't actually notice. So it's important that there are some reference points and that this is part of an interaction and that reflection is not something that's simply done on one's own, particularly at the trainee level. Excuse me. So remembering that, of course, a lot of what the trainee, the registrar will do is not what we tell them to do, but what they observe. So this whole process of modelling is really important. If you are in the process of having these conversations yourself, talking about patients or having the conversation with a registrar, then that's something, that habit is something which they will build on and they will continue to use. It's a practice, it's a behaviour, it needs to be practiced. You know how hard it is to change behaviours. Think about the learning trajectories, think about where the trainee is headed and where they are at the moment. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. We all are moving at different paces in different areas. There'll be some particular areas of clinical practice where your registrar is on top of it and will be able to display much more sophisticated behaviours. But there'll be other areas where they're struggling a bit more with the underlying science or the management, or they just haven't had the experience. And so it's more challenging for them to even use sophisticated communication skills, let alone some of these reflective skills. Think about safety in terms of the discussion. There needs to be a safe place. It needs to be safe for the trainee to make these disclosures to you as the supervisor. And they need to know what's going to happen to the information that they give you. If you're separating out the idea or ignoring the idea differences between formative and summative assessment, what you're doing is you're collecting information as you go with the idea of that student developing and growing rather than it being simply for the purposes of assessment. Oops, sorry, one too many. And of course, with safety comes the issue of respect. So engaging in those conversations yourself and giving the registrar room to acknowledge where their limits are and acknowledging that those limits are going to be tighter than most of ours. So you'll be familiar with this cycle that before we see a patient, we think about what we're going to do, we get the file, particularly if it's a teaching cycle, we prepare for it. If you're sitting in with the registrar, you might talk with the registrar about the patient that's coming up or about how they're going to approach this problem. The encounter occurs, debriefing happens, frequently not as it is not as frequent perhaps as the briefing, and certainly this process of what happens after the debriefing, turning this encounter into meaning is the bit that we need to then pick up on and think more about. Okay, so that said, some of you may be familiar with the work of Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago with his ideas of fast and slow thinking. What he said was that there are two different types of thinking. One is this fast thinking that we do that's almost unconscious. It's essentially pattern recognition. We deal with common and familiar problems. And that happens. The more the expert we are, the more frequently that happens. The slow thinking is where we're using our reasoning processes and problem solving. And this is where the discussion about reflection comes in very naturally. That's when it happens with new, difficult, complex and nuanced problems. I actually don't agree with Kahneman that there are two separate systems. I think we're using both systems all the time. We're using them in a very sophisticated way to deal with the problems that we know about and to challenge ourselves, hopefully, about those aspects of the problem we're not sure about. Over the complex and non-routine cases, what we know when we're faced with a complex case is that we tend to respond, and this research came from Dutch GPs, tend to respond to difficult problems by looking for alternative explanations, not leaping straight away to a single diagnosis. We then test these explanations or predictions against data. So we go back to the patient, we ask for some more information. Then we look at the problem itself and test our particular prediction against the problem. And the final thing about this whole process is that people who are effective at this tend to display an attitude of reflection as problem solving. They would think about this and open themselves up to the area of problem solving and making meaning of what they've just seen. This ability to examine one's thinking process or the metacognitive processes is a pretty high order area of reflection. It's one that's talked about a lot. It's something that comes after a lot of clinical practice and after you've been in the habit of reflecting on your clinical practice, which is why the simple examples that I put before are really important. This metacognition, by that I mean thinking about the encounter with the patient as it's happening, thinking about the encounter with the patient as it's happening and identifying while it's happening, oh, that wasn't such a good question, or this isn't going so well, or there's something going on here that I'm not getting. And I'm sure you've had those experiences. Being aware of those, what Sean referred to as reflection in action, that's a very active part of reflection, is a highly sophisticated and expert technique, and it's one that we want our trainees to grow into. They need to be sufficiently familiar with the clinical processes, but they also need to be familiar and practiced with this idea of reflection and making meaning of what they're doing in order to get to the next more complex level. This cycle that came from Professor Ken Cox in the early 90s has encapsulates some of these issues. Whilst I would probably change the wording a little bit, it's thinking about the dual cycle, the double cycle here of experience and explanation. And as a number of you mentioned a number of you mentioned when I asked you, how would you know? it came to this last bit. The point of the clinical experience and the explanation cycle is discussing, unpacking, developing working knowledge, and looking at what you're going to do differently with the next patient. That's really the outcome that we want from a reflective discussion after a patient, is how is this going to alter what you do with a patient with a similar problem or a similar patient with a more complex problem in the future. So how are you going to move along? So moving back into the assessments, what we found by looking at students at various levels over the last 15 years in this process and trying to sift through the literature, which in most cases is fairly unhelpful, we found that there were some key features to what we were looking for. It's not just about feedback, but it's actually about structuring and seeking feedback and then acting on it. So we would hope that our trainees and registrars would act on feedback, but are they going and seeking it? Are they seeking you out to get feedback or other people in the practice? So that's the first observation that we've made about effective reflective practice in the people that we're working with. The second is having a sense of the emotional responses that we have to patients or to situations, and just being aware that we have those emotional responses and hopefully having a conversation about the intensity or the impact of those emotional responses and developing an awareness of how those emotional responses might influence our decision making for a particular patient. Strong emotional responses, positively or negatively, we know there's good data that they will impact on the communication style and communication patterns, but they also impact on the sorts of decisions that we make. They're the very reasons why we avoid treating our immediate family members, because we can't distance ourselves from the emotional part of the decision making. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but this is the other key factor that we've found in terms of reflective practice with our senior students, and that is recognising personal limits and having some plans to address them. So the plan might be that there are deficits that need to be addressed, or the plan might be, this is how I'm going to manage this patient, and here's who else I'm going to get involved in the management process. So taking us on then to a more assessment-focused part of this, if you're having your discussions with the trainees, we found there are a number of questions that we've used that you might like to use not immediately after a patient, but perhaps when you're having a conversation towards the latter part of an attachment, or maybe at the end of a month, asking some questions like, okay, what's a situation or a dilemma that you've encountered and how was it resolved? And what sort of investigations did you use to resolve the dilemma? Thinking about where there was uncertainty, how did they deal with the uncertainty? And therefore, the important bit here, how does this experience assist you moving forward in the clinical practice? A second question is to say, well, has anything happened that you weren't really happy about? Give us a bit of a story of what happened and why you weren't happy with it and the way that you handled it. What was the outcome? What are you going to do next time as a result of this particular experience? And dealing with some of the emotional aspects. So talking about things that people found difficult or stressful and how they managed the situation. Junior doctor and medical student health and stress is lots in the media at the moment, but helping people understand how they can respond to those stressful situations and talking about how you respond to similarly stressful situations or getting colleagues to talk about it, provide them with a variety of tools then to protective behaviours for your registrar in their development. So when you are going through this process, there's good evidence from around the world now that narrative rather than numbers, narrative data are the things that are going to provide you with clues in terms of the development and understanding of your registrar. And by looking at how you're recording things and looking for particular words, patterns that occur, you'll come to understand better where the trainee is and where they're developing. The narrative, when you go back and reread what you've written about trainees, and that don't have to be a lot, they might just be a paragraph after you've had an interaction, or once a week you might write some notes. But these narratives, if you look back at them, you'll spot words that recur that may actually be flags for you, things that you want to intervene on. And I've mentioned here, we talked about trajectories. The analogy that I use here is the pediatric growth charts. Think about the registrar as on a growth chart, that they're going to develop over a period of time. There will be times where the growth is flat, there'll be times where the growth is quite quick, but also the head circumference doesn't always grow at the same rate as the length, so that they will be developing at different rates for different particular skills and in different areas. So considering that this is a process of growth and not something that all needs to be done at once, given that we're changing and reinforcing a behaviour. I put down here also the question of insight. Frequently we find clinical supervisors say, the registrar didn't have any insight, or they lacked insight. And that is often used as an all or none phenomenon. And once you've made that an all or none phenomenon, then you can't really intervene. You either have it or you don't. Whereas I think a lot of what's going on, if we unpack the term insight in a clinical setting, a lot of it is about reflective behaviour and self-direction. And if you think about it in those terms, we can intervene on the reflective behaviours using some of the techniques and skills that I mentioned before, and build the capacity of the trainee and the registrar, so that when you find yourself saying, oh, they don't have insight, I'd ask you to step back a little bit and think, okay, what are you observing that tells you that they haven't got insight? And what are the interventions that you might need? What are the levels of interventions that might be required? Is it something way back at the 3-question mark that I started off with? Or is it something to do with the patient debriefing and meaning making? So they're skills that can be developed. Insight, maybe the booby prize. Certainly what we want is behaviour change and behaviour development. Now, unfortunately, all is not entirely rosy in the area of reflective practice. There are some potential pitfalls. One of the big pitfalls, where I started off with, is that there's little conceptual clarity over what we mean by reflective practice. There are lots of definitions out there, and none of them really capture particularly well what it is that we're looking at and what you've described in the terms you put down when I asked you those questions. So think about this and think about what definition you want to work with. So what is it that you mean by reflective practice, and work with that. It's, I think, going to become clearer in the literature in a little while, but clinical practice doesn't have good conceptual clarity either. A lot of what we do, particularly in general practice in the community, is clouded in a lack of theoretical frameworks. So this isn't a complete loss, but it's something we need to think about. And when you ask for assistance, you need to be clear on, say, reflective practice. You need to then ask for assistance on what it is that you want rather than just reflective practice, because the term will mean different things to different people. The connection, there's an entire school of thought which sees reflection as an internal psychological process and not necessarily resulting in action. That's popular in the psychological literature, but doesn't really help us in terms of practice. So we need to try and reinforce that connection between reflection and action. One of the arguments against assessing reflection is that if you give people a formula to follow, like the what, so what now formula, and they follow it continuously, then you end up with this routine response. People then just do it. It's not deep learning. It's not actually a response to reflection. They've simply learned to do it like the rat in the maze. So we need to vary the amount of the the activities, and we need to encourage people to come to us with that reflection. It's hard to force people into it. In the beginning, we certainly force our students into it and say, you have to do this, and over time they develop the behaviours. But we try to avoid that routinisation of, here it is again, I've just got to write about it. There are issues, ethical issues about privacy and autonomy of the registrar, so we need to think about those. What might be disclosed, what might not. If you're involved in a program that uses reflective portfolios, you need to think what should go in there. How should that be encapsulated? How much emotional response, for example, should go into a reflective portfolio? Reflective writing frequently to our students and trainees means writing about what they're thinking and feeling about. And if they're doing that, that's fine for their own personal use and for putting things away. But I would say at this point to them, if you're doing this for the purposes of reflective practice development, think about the cycle, think about the activity, and importantly, what you're going to change as a result of it. If one of the issues that comes up for you is emotional, by all means document it, but document what you would be happy to have other people see. So you need to, a bit of self-censorship might be the place here. Now, the other issue which faces us is that there's some evidence emerging that this idea of reflective practice might actually decrease with our user practice, which if you think back to one of the first teaching techniques that we talked about, and that was modelling, that could be problematic. There is as we become more expert, as we develop more experience, we develop a better library of cases. We've seen lots of things like this before, and we can quickly come to a management decision, sometimes a diagnostic decision, although the evidence is that we don't. Probably about half the time the diagnostic decision isn't as important as the management decision. But the decision, the further we get from our training, there is good evidence that our clinical decisions are more often associated with a premature closure, that is an early attachment to a particular diagnosis or management strategy, and that leads then to a mistake with the patients. And this happens because of our large library bank. So it's highly likely that this promotion of reflective practice decreases with years in practice, simply because of the developing expertise and the way in which expertise plays out in psychologically in all of us, that we've seen a lot of it before, therefore we can get there very quickly. The fast thinking part of the fast and slow thinking. So for ourselves, we need to keep the slow part going along the way and asking ourselves questions about the diagnosis and trying to resist that premature closure. We see premature closure in junior people fairly frequently. They see a single feature of a disease and they jump to a diagnosis. We, those of us that have got lots of experience, will see a pattern of previous conditions and often jump to a diagnosis. So we need to have our antennae twitching or any data that might actually challenge that diagnosis. So the other possibility with using practice is that if you're wrestling with difficult cases and you find that you refer them early rather than going through the problem-solving process, this might also reduce your reflective opportunities. And again, looking back at the European general practice experience, this was observed in a number of GPs. So it's not entirely rosy. However, if you're going to consider reflective practice and discussions with your trainee, then it's not unlike most communication activities, communication with patients, communication with other staff members, indeed frequently communication with the family, is think about a suitable environment. You need a safe environment and a place where this is going to happen. Go in with a plan, not an outcome, but a plan of the process, and do try to make it as routine as possible. Make the conversations as frequent as fits in with your practice pattern and with your interactions with the trainee. The more practice the trainee gets at this, the more likely they are to start doing it themselves and develop the next level, which is initiating these discussions, these reflective discussions, rather than simply initiating clinical discussions. You need to be prepared for concerns that might arise and be prepared to follow up both the discussion and the concerns in terms of looking after the trainee, but also thinking about that trainee's well-being, but thinking about how they are preparing themselves for the next similar challenge. And I put here assessing the reflection. After these encounters, it's worth making some notes for yourself. The narrative, as I mentioned before, becomes a really important source of your end-of-term report and your mid-term report. The narrative may be something that actually becomes the meat of the next conversation with the registrar, but you can talk about what's been happening, what level of reflection are we talking about, and what is it that we need to deal with next time, or where is the trainee, and are we stuck at the same level for some time? Do we need to intervene to make the reflections more sophisticated? So all of these were taken from a paper in Medical Teacher a couple of years ago, thinking about reflective practice discussions in the clinical environment. I'll leave you with another quote from Donald Schoen, that reflective practice is not likely to flourish if it's seen as a second-class activity. If the focus is on the diagnosis and the management, if the focus is on the therapeutics or on something else, and reflection is not seen as an integral part of our interactions, then the students quite reasonably will not give it the status that it needs. And if they're forced to choose between passing an exam or passing the assessments and getting involved in reflective practice, I know where the money will go. So the part of your role as the supervisor is to make this not only as routine, but to give it the status that it needs, to let the student know that this is what's happening, and to use this opportunity to reflect back to the registrar about their own performance and giving them some skills, either from your experience or from the literature, on how you can deepen the reflections that they're having. That way, when the time comes for you to write a supervisory report, you've got some narrative, you've had the conversation with the registrar, and you're able to provide good feedback to the training program, and you'll be pretty clear on whether or not you want that person working with you or not. On that note, thank you very much for exploring this topic. I'm happy to take any questions that you want to pop in the remaining couple of minutes. Otherwise, I'll leave you my email address and can take questions offline.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter, for an excellent webinar. I think one which we can all take some time to reflect on. I saw some great comments in the chat box tonight about behaviours you can indicate your GP registrars displaying reflective practice. There were some really excellent comments. So,
Indeed.
yeah, fantastic. We'd really like everybody's feedback. Marissa's just sent out the email asking for feedback on tonight's webinar. So hopefully you'll all get back to us soon. We're currently looking at our webinar series for 2018. So if you'd like to suggest a topic, get in touch with us at admin@gpsupervisorsaustralia.org.au. All our contact details are on our website, and we'll have this webinar loaded up to our GPSA YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. But just before I go, I just wanted to acknowledge that GPSA is supported by funding from the Australian Government under the Australian General Practice Training Program, and to thank you again, Peter. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us tonight.
It's been a pleasure, thank you. And I like one of the comments here, reflection can be rigorous. Yes, so it can be rigorous, so please go out and reflect out loud.
Love it. Thanks a lot, everybody. Good night, safe travels. Thank you.